Good morning, everybody. So I'm on a team at Microsoft that's responsible for helping the company understand the energy industry. And for us, energy means oil and gas, power utilities, and mining. I grew up in oil and gas. I spent about 13 years in the oil and gas industry before joining Microsoft 5 years ago. So really for us, understanding the industry is the best way to be able to build stuff for the industry. And I'll talk a little bit about kind of what we're seeing as thought leaders. So let me start a little bit with trends. I'm going to talk about trends. I'm going to talk also about some of the case studies that we're seeing as a response to these trends. So let me start with this trend here, 51 billion tons of carbon per year. So 51 million tons of carbon per year. This is huge. You think about the data coming from sensors in the pumping unit, rigs, the gas turbines, gas processing stations, boosting stations, all these infrastructure, and along with what you and I do, we flew here and contributed to this 51 billion tons. That's a lot of carbon. So if we need to get to net zero by 2050, we need to get a baseline. Where is this 51 billion coming from? What assets? What assets are driving most of it? How do we reduce it? Do we need to rebundle gas turbines and compressors? Do we need to change fuel nozzles in certain assets? Do we need to just go and infuse more electricity into certain operations? So those are the kind of things that a trend like this helps us understand. Also, new energy customers. We're all in the energy industry or associated to the energy industry in some way. Our end customer is people like you and I. We want to consume energy in a different way. We want to be able to know that we're consuming 50% renewable, 25% renewable, 75% renewable. We want to know that we're doing it now or next week. We want to know that our EV can either have a charging station maybe 50 miles from now, or we want to be able to switch between regular fuel and EVs. We're complex. So the average energy company has to be able to adjust to this complexity. The other trend I'll call out is sustainability goals. So we saw a company like Exxon set a sustainability goal this year. Companies like BP, Shell, Total, Repsol, Schlumberger, Baker Hughes, they've all set net zero goals. And that's a lot of work, right? So a lot of these companies don't have a clear plan to get to net zero, and that's scope 1 and scope 2. So scope 1 being the carbon footprint in your core operations, scope 2 being the energy that you consume, and then scope 3 is actually the carbon footprint from the products that you produce. So if you're producing fuel, as an example, how do you measure the carbon footprint coming to that? That is a fantastic data problem, in my view. And so those are sort of the exciting opportunities that are being created from a lot of the trends that we're seeing. So I'll dive right into use cases. So if you agree with some of those trends, and I've sort of picked the most important ones for our conversation, sort of focusing on a data future here, this is how Microsoft sees the industry and the needs coming from the industry. We call these industry priority scenarios, and I'll run through them at a high level, and I'll dive into one question per category. Operate for the future. These are the operational excellence related use cases, bread and butter use cases, health and safety, supply chain, connected assets. These are use cases like predictive maintenance, autonomous operations, things like that. Something like physics-based models. This is where all the subsurface workloads, things like seismic processing, those use cases live there. This is what the oil and gas industry was built on. So use cases that enable that and help to improve the efficiency of operations, those live and operate for the future. Transform your workforce. These are all the people-centric use cases. What we're learning, especially with the pandemic, is that energy companies are thinking more creatively about how they enable their people. How do you enable the field worker of the future? So a field worker goes out and needs support. Maybe it's a field worker who is early in their career. How can they get support from someone back at headquarters? How do you collaborate today at work? I hope you're using Teams and enjoying it, right? That's a huge use case. And we saw that in the pandemic. Process improvement. Imagine taking paper-based use cases and turning them into something more digital as well. All those use cases live in transform your workforce. The fourth one is transition to clean. So transition to clean, I like to think of this as all the steps that an energy operator can take to get to net zero. So we talked about net zero earlier. So one, the operator needs to be able to measure their emissions. What's the baseline? So we talked about how this is a classic data problem. If you are a BP or a Shell, what is your baseline carbon footprint per year? Today, that is a very manual process. The average energy operator usually needs 6 months to gather up their carbon footprint to be able to communicate it in their sustainability report. It's a massive undertaking. We also call out environmental performance as well, being able to measure things like water, right, and waste. Those things we found are very, very important. The other use case is manage and reduce carbon. So once you get a baseline of your carbon, how do you reduce it, right? So is that through carbon capture? Is that through a change in your operations? Those are the things that you would think about in this case. And data is very important because the data can tell you what parts of your operation to target. The third thing is infusing your operations with renewables. So in the end, they're just operations that need to be electrified, right? So you think about using more electricity in operations that are run maybe right now with gas or diesel, switching that and infusing more electricity. We're seeing more of that happen, and we think it's important to get to net zero. And then finally, regardless of what energy is generated, whether it's conventional energy or renewable energy, distributing it using a smart grid is crucial. So in essence, that is our point of view on the 4 steps to get to net zero. Finally, reimagine energy. What we started seeing is that energy operators that basically are able to do a good job in transition to clean started asking us, hey, Microsoft, can you educate us on use cases where we can actually make money in this area? That we can actually turn the work that we're doing inside the company into value. So the use cases in this area are things like EVs. So companies like Total and BP are investing in charge points or actually buying EV fleets and trying to turn that into a business model. So how can we help them build a data platform around that? That's an example. There are use cases like accelerate energy efficiency. Within there, we think about use cases like smart buildings and how do you make sure when you go into a building or exit a building, that building makes decisions on temperature based on the number of people using it. It turns off the lights. Those are ways to reduce the carbon footprint, and there are companies that are actually turning that into value. So those are kind of a couple use cases that I wanted to call out, and I wanted to actually dive into some examples. So in Operate for the Future, I talked about physics-based models. So very recently, we launched a product called Microsoft Energy Data Services. And so just stepping back and looking at it from a business and a value to operations, one of the things that we saw was that the energy industry is looking for ways to do more, to be more efficient in the workflows. So you look at seismic processing, reservoir imaging, all that, all the way to production. That whole workflow, for some of you in the room who've been in that business or are in that business, that is a very, very, very painful data exercise. So we've worked with OSDU for the last 7 years and built a product that basically helps the data to be usable across various applications, so Delphi, DS365, Blueware, Enterica, you name it, while leveraging the same data estate. So this is a wonderful, wonderful sort of data enriched use case while leveraging a lot of the cooperation that we use in the industry. Some of you are probably part of OSDU. So this, I would say, maybe the learning here is the importance of partnership to get these data-enabled use cases to work. The other use case I'll share is what we're doing with Chevron. So Chevron, and they've allowed us to tell the story, in their refineries, they enable their field workers with HoloLenses. So a HoloLens is a device that you wear on your head. For those who don't know what it is, it's very similar to, for any of you who've used mixed reality devices, MR devices, the difference here is it's augmented reality. So you can actually see what's in front of you, and you can see an augmented vision over that. As an example, the field service technicians who go out to refineries and are interested in looking at inspections, they're able to get support back from headquarters. So for example, I might be at a refinery and I see an inspection job that I don't understand. I can make a Teams call back to a colleague who can see what I'm seeing and can actually offer support. They can annotate, they can pull up a drawing that I can see and help to make decisions right there. So this is huge. It's an absolute big game changer for Chevron. They're able to leverage a small group of very experienced people who are located around the world to enable a huge, huge footprint of colleagues who might not have as much experience, but are now empowered to make a ton of impact. The other example I wanted to share is going to transition to clean is with BP. So we talked about companies needing to have a baseline of their carbon footprint. We worked with BP to build a digital twin for carbon footprint. In essence, a carbon twin. So at Claridge, one of their offshore rigs, you think about it, the valves, the gas turbines, the compressors, all the moving pieces, any single sensor that gathers information, we integrated that data into one data lake. And in some cases, the carbon footprint comes as part of the sensor data. In some cases, we had to make inferences. But basically, there's now a digital twin that gives a real-time view of the carbon footprint of that rig. So you imagine ingesting that information real-time into your sustainability report generation process. If you do that, something like this across your full operation, you might even be able to launch 2 sustainability reports per year because it's more real time. So this is just an example, one asset, but the idea is to do this across the full company. And finally, Reimagine Energy. So I shared this as an example earlier about companies that are trying to create dollars out of this transition to clean story. The example I wanted to give is about Northern Lights. So some of you might have heard of Northern Lights. It is a project between the Norwegian government, amongst the Norwegian government, Equinor, Shell, Total, and Microsoft is the technology partner for this. The Norwegian government saw the cement industry in Western Norway as a huge area that was ripe for decarbonization. Cement industry, for some of you that know, is a heavy emitter. And so the idea is to capture the carbon from, and these are using point solutions to capture the carbon from the cement industry, sequester it by, first of all, shipping it offshore using a cryogenic vessel, and then sequestering it in a offshore project called Project Longhorn. Our contribution is to build a carbon management layer at the sort of the base of all of this, from capture all the way to sequestration. It will require clear sort of understanding of each CO2 molecule captured, being able to monitor it as it's getting shipped, when it gets sequestered, monitoring it as well, and then imagine carbon offsets are created and traded from this as well. That is a huge, huge data exercise, and it's something we're working on with the Northern Lights team right now. So those are just the examples I wanted to share. Just sort of refreshing again, I talked a bit about trends that we're seeing in the industry. And in response to those trends, especially trends that impact data, I shared a couple examples about how Microsoft is leveraging data to help the industry. So thank you so much, and looking forward to your questions during the panel.